specifically looking at impact. Sorry, an hour and a half, roughly, looking at impact and impact the European Union Commission proposals. As was discussed yesterday, impact is a really important element of proposals. It's becoming more and more important. So if you want to be successful in applying for funding, it's really important and critical to get this part right. So the first part is I just want to have a bit of a discussion around the table and online if you want to type in the chat box what you think. So what do you around the table think is impact in European proposals and European grant funding? What kind of things do you think it covers? So, on some people in a minute. Maybe we'll just go around the table. So do you want to start?
In academic and practical terms, maybe?
It can be anything because impact's very broad. So think about it from your perspective, maybe that might be.
So raising the awareness on importance of the topic of the project on the one hand, then raising the awareness on the gap in the literature on that topic, impact on the overall society or target group of the project, maybe better.
Great, thank you.
Well, it's quite broad, but something that needs to be sustainable related to the topic. So basically making the change, increasing the awareness about the topic on a long term.
Okay, great. I like that. I like the answers from everyone. Do you have anything to add?
In fact, maybe when you solve some problem, when we are had awareness about some problem in Europe, and then impact is the maybe way to solve that problem.
Great, thank you.
I would maybe underline with this. I think impact is a final goal.
Final goal.
Yeah, to reach something you as a aim.
Great.
Let's see. Okay, so maybe for the beginning, at first introducing the society or the problem, what you're doing, what is important to you, because maybe someone will realize that that will also become important to them. Then the fact that everybody who are involved in this project are finding this topic important. So then something similar, like my colleague previously said, raising the awareness of the problem and somehow making the network between not only researchers but also other people who are interested in solving that problem. So if we are more people in the network, then we can approach the problem in many different ways, and then we can consider the problem on another level. So probably the solution would be better. Something like that, and also many other things that others said for me.
Great, thank you.
It depends on the topic.
Sorry.
Go ahead, yes. Thank you. For example, in our case, we deal with water purification. The impact can be in the research field, university, research centers, universities, students. For example, it can be basis for applying for new projects, and in the case of business, it's especially in the field of agriculture and companies, and for example, pharmaceutical companies in the case of removal of some organic pollutants from water. And in the case of civil society, it can be for example, impact on professional association and citizens at large.
Milos is raising his hand. Yes.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I would like to say something from my proposal that was very important when it comes to the impact. Besides the target groups that are very important to be defined in this section, the scale and significance is something new in these European new calls. And that scales goes from the local level to the national level, regional level, and okay, EU level. But at the regional level, it's sometimes very important to state a number in millions of people that will be affected by the results of our projects. That's something that was for me quite astonishing. And I didn't expect it, so I wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that is very relevant. Thank you so much.
Nico. Okay, so in my view, in most general terms, impact would be something that the project contributes to the society, some problem, and moving forward on some issues. And now that could be specified in more specific terms for specific problems. So in our case, perhaps that would be resolving some problem with the environment and giving a contribution to moving forward on mitigating some problems with climate, with water, with pollution, soil, and so on.
Yeah. Anyone else online before we?
Okay, so maybe I would say the impact is the benefits, so either environmental, social, economic, financial, to different target group and society at large, and also there are changes in outcomes. But what we are always talking always about positive ones, but there are also negative ones which our project produce. We don't talk about them too much, so we want to emphasize only the positive ones, but there are also the negative ones. So we should get the whole picture out there.
Has anyone typed anything online?
No, people online are silent for the time being, but it would be really lovely if somebody spoke up and just shared opinion. There are many colleagues that we know that had good, successful projects.
And this is really important part of the proposal.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. So regarding the impact, I would say it is actually quantitative measure. How will your project impact on different kind of fields, like well-being of usual average people, how much people will your project employ, how much you will raise the bar in your research field. So it should be some quantitative measure of your project results. How many people or different group of people will be affected by the results of your project. So that's how would I define this impact.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks.
If I could add, establishment of the network between the experts from the different fields that could contribute in establishment of different future projects, maybe. Also.
Yes, yes.
Anything else to add?
It is a very complicated thing, especially for us who are not used to explaining how our research will affect everyone around us. So it can be really, sometimes it can be really overwhelming, but it's something that we have to think, because we don't do research because of the research, you have to do the research because of the other people around us, environment, etc. So in New Horizon Europe proposals, we should explain how it will have how our research is going to have economic benefits or impacts, so social impacts and scientific impact, so different kinds of indicators. Yeah, so it can be sometimes complicated and overwhelming, and I think it's really important for us to learn how to express the impact that our research will have on different aspects of environment, let's say.
Thank you. Anything else to add?
Maybe it's a good way to start with your stakeholders and make a nice little spreadsheet who your stakeholders would be, and then try to, the widest possible group, and then try to figure out who will be affected in what way, and if it's possible to affect someone with your research and with results of your research. So to go from the very end users back to your research, that would be my strategy. That is my strategy. And then you can sort things out on the go. How will I affect the farmer, or how will I affect the entire community of health practitioners and patients, or whoever is that you're targeting the project with? So maybe that's a useful way to start from the very back.
No, that's not the bad.
And to define why, what for am I doing this research? Who will have the benefits from it? Yeah.
And how to measure it, it's always a tricky part. So everybody's talking about the quantitative ones at once. So it's more easier than the social aspect. If you measure behavioral change or something, then you need to dive into the qualitative research. And it's always more complex it's not that exact.
And sometimes when you're thinking about that kind of thing, you need to think about your partnership as well. So coming back to some of what we talked about yesterday, if you're not an expert in measuring social impact, you might want to think about having a partner in who is, with the kind of evaluation and seeing how your project's going and monitoring. So that's just something to think about there. Oh, that was super. Thank you so much for your contributions. That was really interesting. And the thing I think is really interesting is you all said different things from different perspectives. So that was really cool. And I think the thing for me is impact's very specific to individual projects. You can't read somebody else's impact section in the proposal and just change it a little bit to fit your project. It's very specific for the research that you're doing. So the main thing that I've come across is impact equals value. So it's quite clear any research should lead to some kind of impact, but the typical impact is driven by the motivation to carry out the actual project, not actually what might happen beyond it or as a result of it. And for that's what you need to create impact. You have to think beyond the project itself. And this is quite a common pitfall, and usually where problems start occurring, because the expectations of impact in Horizon Europe are much broader than just having some research findings or some publications or some papers. And so there are a lot of elements of it that are really important. So I'm going to run through some of those elements and hopefully give you some ideas of things that you can think about when you're writing your proposals and thinking about impact from your research. So I like this point as well. The results are obviously important, as we've talked about, but they don't inherently create the impact of the project. So if that's all you put in your impact section, it'd be very superficial, it wouldn't be funded, and also it doesn't meet the expectations of the European Commission. Impact is a really important part of what they're talking about, and it doesn't respond to the context of impact and the other elements which we've talked about, the impact on society, the impact on the environment. Just publishing a paper on, let's say, pollution in a river doesn't create its own impact in itself. So you need to actually undertake activities to then get that from a publication and a paper to the right stakeholders and inform the right people. Going back to what Geiger says about the stakeholder mapping, it's very important. So some of the things to think about when you are first starting to think about impact is some questions which can be useful to just kind of get you thinking about this initially. So the first one is what will happen after you reach your target and have your project results? What will happen after the project's finished? What's going to happen at that point? What are the next steps which extend beyond the project scope? So what needs to happen after the project's finished as well? And I like this term, the word legacy. I think you probably wrote some of this in the proposal about sustainability or legacy. So when the project's finished, how will people remember it? What has it achieved that can lead to new things or change what's going to happen in the future? And it's important to think about a really broad range of things which are relevant to the specific content of the project, not just the very small pieces of research that are going on in it, but you have to think very broadly about the bigger picture. And it's challenging to do, which is why I've got some kind of techniques to kind of help you think about this a bit later. Okay, so there are three key, what we call impact pathways. So a pathway to impact is a set of activities that you do to achieve impact from your research findings. That's how we define pathways to impact. So the first one, we've talked about some of these already, is scientific impact. So this is I've generated some knowledge, I've furthered the field, we've got more people working in this specific research domain, we've shared this with the research community, we've published it in open source places so academics can access the research and the findings that we've had. And I think as an academic, you often think this is the most important, and to some extent it is, but not where the European Commission are concerned. So it's a part of the bigger picture. It will also depend what kind of project you're doing as well, where the focus might lie between these three areas. The second area is about societal impact, so which EU policies and priorities are you addressing, which global challenges. The sustainable development goals have come up a lot in European Commission funding recently, so which ones of those is your research working towards? Delivering benefits and impact through those missions, and also strengthening the uptake of research innovation in society. So how are you going to try and encourage society to take up your findings from the research that you've done? And finally, we have economic or technological impact. So by investing in research, it tends to generate innovation-based growth. So it might be you've developed a new product in your project which may be suitable for commercialization or licensing to companies, and it could actually really generate income for wherever that company's based. And your organisation as well could get royalties from that intellectual property, which I think my colleague Adam's going to talk about later. And it, potentially it's creating more jobs in a particular area if you've really developed something nice that expands everything out later. And it also leverages investments in research and innovation, because you're showing value for money. If you come back to my first slide, impact equals value. So one of the things we have to do in the UK when we write funding proposals is we have to show an interest from industry or other types of partners, and they provide a contribution of some kind, even if it's an in-kind contribution. So it's them giving their time to the project. And our funders use that to lobby our government for more funding, because they can say, these projects leveraged £1 million of UK industry funding towards this project. So, and then they can provide a bigger picture to their funders. So anything like that is really strong in terms of justifying your position. So, sorry, this is a little bit small, I think we could send you the slides later. So this is just kind of summarising those. So the first one, scientific impact, it kind of says the same thing really, but I just thought it was quite a nice picture to demonstrate it. So you can have a look at this when you're thinking about impact and check that you're ticking all the right areas. Okay, so then we'll come on to the proposal part now. So in the impact section of your proposal, you have three important sections. The first one is your pathways towards impact, which I'll run through first. Then we have our measures to maximise impact and our summary canvas. Now, measures to maximise impact does include dissemination and communication, but I'm going to cover that more in detail this afternoon, so I'll focus more on the exploitation part this morning. So the first part of this is your pathways towards impact. And this all starts with your results of your project. So these are the immediate short-term outputs of your project. So they can be your deliverable reports, guidelines, they could be know-how, a new technique of doing some research, there could be some new data about a specific problem, new algorithms, It could be anything, prototypes of new technologies, demonstration projects, databases, but also trained researchers. As well, yesterday we talked about the Marie Curie doctoral networks. You might have a whole cohort now of new trained researchers in a particular topic. And the project results need to correspond to the objectives that we talked about yesterday, as well as to the scope in the topic description. So as you can see, this all kind of starts linking together to some of the things that I spoke about yesterday. The second area is around outcomes. So these are the expected effects over the medium term of projects supported under a given topic. So one of the things we went over yesterday in that printout of the funding call was the expected outcomes of the project. And it's not necessarily expected that you would achieve all those outcomes in the project lifetime, but you would achieve them longer term in a lot of cases. So those outcomes are actually really important when it comes to thinking about your pathways to impact, because you've got to try and demonstrate how you will achieve those outcomes. So the results of the project should naturally lead into the outcomes. They should kind of flow into each other. And this occurs by things like dissemination of your project findings, communication of what's occurring within the project, and exploitation, which I'll come on to later. And these outcomes need to directly correspond to what was written in that core topic. So you've really got to make sure they're very well aligned. It might be you have some additional outcomes that weren't mentioned there, and that's totally fine, but you have to make sure you're answering the ones that are in core categories. Okay. Then finally we have impact. So from these outcomes, we have wider long-term effects on society and the environment, the economy and science, and the broader world, basically. And these are enabled by the outcomes of research and innovation investment. Now, it is recognised that research is not always, it doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go. And projects don't always have the outcomes that you think they're going to have, because it is research and there is a risk associated with it. But generally, when you invest in some kind of research and innovation, there is some kind of outcome or output that progresses society in some way and propels it forward from where it was before. So these generally occur after the end of the project, these impacts. So there might be the odd one that you might achieve within the project lifespan. Like I think we're going to achieve some within EXtremeClimTwin, for example, from the roadmap we've developed. And there are some things that we're going to genuinely achieve within the project. But a lot of them will come afterwards. A lot of them come maybe 3 years after the end of the project. So it's important to recognise that. And it's important to recognise your commitment to a project doesn't just end once the funding's ended. The project's finished, but the work continues in some way. So impact should refer to the specific contribution of the project to the work programme's expected impacts described in the destination under which the chosen topic is situated. So the topic we looked at yesterday will be linked to a destination, and it's important to go back again. You know how I mentioned looking at other documents, not just the call. This is where you need to again go back to the kind of main work programme and the kind of introductory text to really understand what types of impacts they're expecting from the projects that they're going to fund under that work programme. So there's lots of things to read, I think, when you apply for this funding. Really. So I thought this picture was quite nice and descriptive. So you've got the outcomes, impacts and pathways. So you can see on here, you've got the project, which runs for a period of time. And then the outcomes are more medium term. So they occur during or shortly after the end of the project. So most of them will be during that period, maybe up to 3 months after the end, particularly for publishing papers. That can take a little bit longer than, because you're not in control of the timescales of that often. And the expected impacts are longer term and will occur sometime after the project. So when you think about pathways to impact, you have to think about the logical steps towards those outcomes and those impacts. And you need to have a plan for how you're going to achieve them and what those are. And this should be beyond the immediate scope and duration of the project. So hopefully that picture gives you an idea of the timings and where everything sort of fits together. So there's some nice examples here. Again, I appreciate it's a bit small, of the types of impacts, outcomes and project results that you might expect from a project. So the top one is looking at expected impacts. I really like this picture. It was from a European Commission webinar, and I think it could be a really good diagram to develop into an element of your proposal. You can make it work effectively. So let's start at the bottom of the diagram, strangely. So you start off with your project results, which are your operational objectives. So this is during the project implementation, as I've said, and it can include things like policy recommendations, methodologies, publications, proof of feasibility, that kind of thing. So an example of that is a successful large-scale demonstration trial with 3 airports of an advanced forecasting system for proactive airport passenger flow management. So by the end of the project, you've had a bit of a demonstration and you can show that it works, or you've learned what does and doesn't work from what you've tried out. From there, you get your expected outcomes, which come from your specific objectives. So these are the effects of the project, such as uptake, diffusion, use and deployment of the project results by your direct target groups. And I'll come on to target groups a little bit later. So the example here is split in half. So we have the example from the work programme, where they're wanting an expected outcome of innovative accessibility and logistics solutions applied by the European transport sector. And then you have the project expected outcomes, which is defined by the people that wrote the project, which is at least 9 European airports adopt the advanced forecasting system that was demonstrated during the project. And you've got to be realistic with what you think about here and what you put, because you can't, let's think about the topic yesterday. So you might say, yes, our new toolkit will be taken up by 214 regions around Europe, but what evidence do you have that all those regions are going to want to use your toolkit? You know, so you have to be realistic and demonstrate that you've thought it through how you're going to achieve that. And then the one at the top is expected impacts. So these are again the wider effects. So the example from the work programme, the strategic plan, is a research and innovation contribution, seamless, smart, inclusive and sustainable mobility services. So as you can see, that's really, really broad compared to this airport thing that they're doing. But it's a very strategic, broad area that all these projects that are funded will contribute towards real change in the sector. The project itself is more specific, which says it aims to increase maximum passenger capacity by 15% and passenger average throughput by 10%, leading up to a 28% reduction in infrastructure expansion costs. So coming back to what your colleague online said, you need to be really specific now. How many people are you going to impact? How many rivers are you going to impact? How many bits of Europe are you going to impact? And you need to be realistic. You can't just pick a number. You need, the reviewers will look at it and go, you really think you're going to put your technology in every single power plant in Europe or something like that? So you need to be quite realistic about what you say you're going to achieve. The next important point to think about is barriers, and this is something I learned in my early proposal writing days. You may have heard of PESTLE analysis before. I personally find this a really useful tool for thinking about the barriers. I mentioned tables yesterday, so one of the things I used to do was put a table in what the potential barriers are to actually achieving the impact from the project and how I'll try and overcome them throughout the project. So, for example, if the barrier is political and you think there might be some political drivers to prevent you achieving some of the impact that you think you would like to, you could overcome that potential by working with local governments and really getting them engaged in the project at an early stage and really get them bought into what it is you're trying to do. So I think it's important to think about all these elements, like the political side of it, but also economic, social, technological, environmental and legal. So it might be you've got something really great you can do, but it might, coming back to Miroslav's point, there might be a really big environmental problem with what it is you want to do. But actually that might be okay because it can, the benefits of it are so much greater than the problem it might cause. So it's important to just demonstrate you've really thought about these and you've really considered how they might impact your project in the long term. Okay. So next we have, I'm speeding through this very fast. Is that okay? Sorry, I'm going very fast. It's okay. Take it easy. Okay. As I mentioned this afternoon, we're going to look at dissemination communication. So I'm just going to talk about exploitation in this bit here. So nice slide here. So exploitation is basically, this is the EU definition, but it's another way of maximising your impact. So exploitation is thinking about further development of whatever it is you've done in the project, creation and marketing of a product or process based on what you found in the project, or it could be using your findings to really influence things like policy, that kind of thing. So it's really applying the research to the real world. And exploitable results are defined as those that can be further used by a range of stakeholders, so that it's quite broad really. And this includes the consortium members that were part of the project in the first place, the broader scientific community across Europe, potential industry, policymakers, government authorities, and the general public as well. The European Commission are quite keen on having the general public having a really good awareness of projects that are going on. So there are different ways to think about exploitation and intellectual property. So it depends what it is you've done in your project. Like a lot of this is very, very project specific. But for example, you could patent whatever it is you've developed in the project as a consortium and protect it. And therefore that puts you in a strong position to be able to commercialise it. You could sell licenses to industry about what it is you've developed. You could protect it as an industrial design, or you could create a new standard. For example, for river pollution, you could create a new standard about what can and can't be emitted into rivers. There's different ways to do that. Now, Adam's going to talk a little bit about intellectual property later when he talks about contracts. But it's important, I think, to really, if you're in a project where it's quite clear you're going to develop something tangible that you think could have commercial potential, that you have some of those discussions with your project partners while the proposal is being developed, so you can write a clear plan about how you will commercialise whatever it is you're doing after the end of the project. And it might be you have an industry partner in your consortium who will take it forward, but you write in the proposal that they'll be paying reasonable royalties to the rest of the consortium because everyone's contributed to developing the technology. So it's a bit complicated and it is very, very project specific. So exploitation defined here is the utilisation of results in developing, creating and marketing a product or process, or in creating and providing a new service, or in standardisation activities. And the ways that you can exploit these things are things like spin-offs and startup companies, new products, patents, a PhD thesis, for example, could encompass some of this stuff. A new standard that will be applied to a certain industry, a new service, a societal activity. So maybe you're doing something about exercise in cities in South Europe. So local authorities are maybe taking this up and implementing some of their findings. There can be licenses as well, but it could lead to further research as well. Maybe it will lead to your next project, depending on what type of thing you've done. And also it can lead to policy change. In order to facilitate further use of your results, exploitation is necessary. So that even if it leads to future research, you have to manage the findings of your project. You can't just expect them to miraculously end up in the world. There is work you have to do to try and make sure that they get out there. Okay, so I've gone through that a lot faster than I thought I was going to, but there we go. So we're going to do, I'll run through this, and then what we're going to do is a group activity, either based on the project we did yesterday or another project. So in Horizon Europe, they've put this new impact summary canvas into the proposal template, and I really like it. I think it's a really nice structure to really get you thinking about your impact from your project. So I'll run through what it looks like, and then you can have a think about how you might complete one of these for yourself. Do you want to maybe hand those out to the groups while I run through the slide? Thank you.
How many people?
Thank you. So
Okay, so 3 of you can work as one crew.
We can.
Okay.
Thomas.
So,
Please.
3 of you can work as a little group of 2. The 3 of you can work as a little bit bigger group. Here you go. And 2 of you can be a little group on your own. Okay, so let me talk you through this first before I let you loose something yourself. So this is a summary, and then I'll run through each section. So the first page covers areas. So the first box covers specific needs. So what are the specific needs that triggered this project? So why is it really needed? So we've got the airport example. Sorry, the speakers pick up if you're talking. Sorry, could you? Thanks. The people online won't be able to hear properly. Thank you very much. There's a couple of examples here based on the airport scenario and an electric component scenario. So hopefully these will give you an idea of the type of things that should go in here. So the first one is, what are the specific needs that triggered this project? So the example of the first one is most airports use flow models of people moving around the airport, and this hampers accurate use. And it's not optimal, so we need to do something about it, is basically the first one. And the second one is electronic components need to get smaller and lighter because that's what end users are expecting. They don't want phones that weigh half a kilo, for example. So, but also there's a problem sourcing the raw materials and it has an environmental impact. So how do we balance those? So it's really thinking about the need behind the project we've got. The second box is looking at the expected results from your project. So what do you expect to generate by the end of the project? So what are the main outcomes and results that you're going to get? So the example here is a successful large-scale demonstrator. Coming back to what I mentioned earlier, they're going to have trialled it in 3 airports. They've got an advanced forecasting system, and they've got an algorithmic model for proactive airport passenger flow management, which I'm sure is very exciting. And then the example 2 is a publication of scientific discovery on transparent electronics. Do note, it doesn't actually say here where it's going to be published, it just says it's a publication. I personally would say you need to say where you're going to try and publish that, but it's up to you. Try and be as specific as you can, don't be generic, because it's criticised very easily. And they've got a new project, so they've developed some more sustainable electronic circuits, and they've trained 3 PhD students in this topic. So that's a really nice result. They've got really, really good new expertise. So the next box is D and F and C, D and E and C measures. So this is dissemination, exploitation and communication measures. So which dissemination, exploitation and communication measures will you apply to the results? And a couple of the examples here are around it's nice to have sort of one for each one, I think. So for the first one, they've patented the model, and that's how they're going to protect that. They've done a scientific publication with the results of the demonstration that's publicly available, and other airports can have a look at that. And they've held an event in a shopping mall to show how the outcomes of the project are relevant to everyday lives. I wonder how that went. Sorry, I wonder how that went in a shopping mall. Yeah.
Showing people how to move around an airport better.
Yeah, well, I truly believe that all of us in this room would add so much more to these than the example given.
These are not very
best.
creative.
Yeah, not really.
The second example is, again, it's patenting the product, but then also licensing it out to other electronic companies. And disseminating it towards the scientific community by attending conferences, having a platform of material compositions for industry, participation at EC project portfolio meetings to disseminate it within the broader EC funded community, and maximise the visibility vis-a-vis companies. And then on the second page, we've got 3 more boxes. So the first one that I think is really important. So this comes back to the stakeholder things, which was mentioned at the beginning. So who will use or take up the results of the project and who will benefit from them? So the first example, we've got 9 European airports, and we've named a couple of them that use the technology. And the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, so maybe there's an association or something that might be interested in findings. And air passengers, but they've put there that it's indirect, they're not directly a target group. And for the example 2, they've got end users, who are consumers of electronic devices, are one of the target groups. And major electronic companies, so Samsung, Apple, that kind of organisation. And then also the scientific community, particularly in transparent electronics. So that these are the groups that they think will either benefit from the project or will take the research or activity further from where it is today. Then we come on to the outcomes. Now we've talked about outcomes, hopefully you all understand what an outcome is now. So this is what change do you expect to see after you've fully disseminated and exploited your project results to those target groups. And this is important because you're going to need to explain for each of those target groups what the outcome is. So you can't write a target group and then not answer it in the outcome section. It's very linked. So example 1 is that 9 airports are going to use this new system. So they're quite ambitious there. They think it's going to go well, and lots of airports are going to take it up. And for example 2, again, they're publishing, so high use of the scientific discovery published, and they're going to they've put how they're going to measure this, which I think is great. So they're going to look at the citation indexes of the project publications and monitor those over time, so they can see how many people are accessing or using the papers and citing them in their own future research. And I mean, this is quite ambitious, but a major electronics company, Samsung or Apple, starts exploiting new products in their manufacturing. So that's a really great outcome, I think, you can achieve something like that. I will just add, in the narrative that goes sort of around this table, you will need to add more detail about how you're going to make that happen. You can't just say, yeah, we're definitely going to make sure Apple use our new technology. You need to talk about how you're going to engage with Apple, how you're going to work with them, and how you're going to actually get them to understand what it is you've done. And the final one is impact. So what are these wider scientific, economic and societal impacts of the project contributing to the impacts in the work programme? Now, not every project will have scientific, economic and societal impacts, but most of them will have all of them, and most of them will have at least 2 of them. And think creatively. If you think your project doesn't have a societal impact, it probably does in some respects. You're just seeing it from a different perspective. So sometimes a discussion around this with colleagues can be really helpful. So the examples here are, and the scientific impact is they've got new breakthrough scientific discovery on passenger forecast modelling. So that's very exciting. World-leading research, that's great. And they've got an economic impact, which is that, the airport efficiency is improved significantly. And this is where, again, where they put those numbers in, like 15%, 28%. So they've been quite specific here. The one below is a bit less specific. So again, the scientific is the new breakthrough scientific discovery. Economic and technological is there's a new market for touch-enabled electric devices. And the societal is there's a lower climate impact of electronics manufacturing, because they're doing a better job around materials sourcing and waste management. So there will always be some of these types of impacts related to what it is you want to do in your project. So we can put these back on the screen as you're working on it. So just feel free to tell me if you want me to move the screen back. But what I'd like to do is, I'm going to say 20 minutes, if we can work together. We've given you a blank template, so either think about the project that you worked on yesterday or any project that you have fresh in your mind.
And actually notify you if there's any problematic terms in there, bring your attention to it, so you can obviously manage your project with that in mind. So Claire's talked a lot today about partnerships, about collaborations. And the unfortunate thing is when we we do work with partners and we do collaborate with other institutions, then typically we'll need an agreement in place, especially if we are sending confidential information. If we're planning to publish, then certainly in the UK, we would always put an agreement in place. Some countries take a bit more of a lax approach to that. And I'm not sure exactly how it works here, but some of this will be focused on UK processes, some will be focused on European Commission as we go through. So typically it starts when you receive your notification of award and you pop along to see GOGA with a grant agreement, and GOGA will process that. And usually those grant agreements are non-negotiable, and it will set out exactly how you yourselves need to operate the project, but also set out the expectations with the partners. So you'll then usually have to put a consortium agreement in place, which is where GOGA would have drafted one for this project, and I'll show you a copy of one of these at the end of this presentation to show you what high level of work you have to do on there. We then have to negotiate with various different partners. This can be problematic, but that consortium agreement will usually override any agreements you've had in place previously. For example, non-disclosure agreements at the application stage. The grant agreement will always take precedence over any agreement that we put in place after that. So if there's a conflict, which we should obviously try to avoid between the two agreements, if the case ended up in court, then there will be a clause that says which one will take precedence, the consortium agreement or the grant agreement, and that will usually be the grant agreement. And as I've said previously, we put agreements in place to avoid disputes, and we generally do that for all activity, whether it's a publicly funded relationship or whether it's just a zero funded collaboration. We would normally get that agreement put in place. The contracts we receive, so I've been asked to look at the red flags in particular with contracts. So many of the contracts we have will have problematic terms. Obviously try to negotiate them, but if we get to a point where we can't progress anymore, then we'll have to make a decision about those. But certainly the negotiation, especially between universities, should enable these obstacles to be overcome. Right, so I don't think we've got any contract professionals in the room, but I just...
We have. As you can see, so.
Have we? Oh.
So,
okay. So.
I'm a little bit of everything, so.
But
I'm a lawyer.
The ladies are dear colleague from the legal office.
From the legal office.
Yeah.
Okay, nice to meet you. I just thought we could probably not do in a 5-minute, but maybe round the table to see if you can actually anticipate any red flags that might make a contract problematic. I don't know if we want to start with our legal team.
Oh, please don't.
Can anybody think of anything that would make a contract something that we would be very reluctant to sign? No?
Yes, I think we do have issues that could be problematic to all of us, and this is intellectual property rights. Or, for example, how to tackle spin-offs or spin-outs from the faculty. These are the very recent issues that we've come across, and these are the bumps on the road, if you ask me personally, and I'm sure if you ask any of the researchers, we do have that. Yeah, this is something that just...
Yeah, when you were talking about this, you being a real private company or enterprise, so we have some legal barriers here by the national law, so we need to respect that when we want to make a spin-off, or so some things we can do, some things what we can't do at the moment, but.
So I'm sorry, we're giving you a very general overview
Yeah.
now. We're not specific with the questions, but maybe since we've been pushed towards technology transfer and spin-outs and spin-offs, maybe a couple of guidelines from your side, and we are public governmental non-for-profit institution. Producing new knowledge.
Yeah, at Loughborough, we do have a special team that deal with spin-out companies. So I'd be honest that that isn't my main area of expertise. I think picking up, there's a lot of government restriction on how you guys operate here, which is obviously going to be different in the UK. So some of the red flags that I'll talk through from our side, there may be a red flag here, while they could be of lesser importance. It depends really. So, for example, we work under charity law in the UK, so that brings some obligations that we have to abide by legally. That might not be the case here in Serbia, if you see what I mean. So there are very different approaches to contracts depending on which country you're in, and that can actually make it so some countries seem harder to contract with unless you understand why, if that makes sense. So as you contract with more international partners, you will build up that knowledge and things. Well, last time I negotiated with a German company, they would accept our governing law or whatever. So you can actually improve your approach there. So the first thing in the UK that is an absolute red flag is the right to publish. So as a UK university, we're here for the public good. We receive public funding, and as such, we need to deliver benefit to the public. So the publication of academic papers is our main purpose in life. So we view the right to publish as one of our most important red lines. Sometimes we approach it slightly differently. So when I talk about charity law in the UK, if we have a consultancy contract, we can put it through our enterprise division, which has slightly different rules. So in that case, we can actually relax the rules a little bit, but there will still be publication and the right to publish within there. We do sometimes accept that if we're the company that's funding us or collaborating with us, that they can actually review the publication, that they can request the removal of any of their confidential information, their background, intellectual property, for example. They can request that removal, and we'll usually put a time frame on it. So it's not unusual to see 90 days for them to actually come back and respond. If they don't respond within that time, then we're within our rights to actually publish. And we also, I don't know if it's the same here in Serbia, but a lot of our projects, we will have students working on there as part of their PhDs. So when we have that scenario, it's obviously vital that that student can publish their thesis at the end of the course. Sometimes when we're working with external companies who might be funding a studentship or providing information for a studentship, if the content is very sensitive, then we can actually work with that company and we can put the thesis in restricted access. So the student still progresses, but there will be a block on people actually viewing that work for whatever period of time we specify in the contract. And I've made a note here, so generally I think you'll use a lot of what we call the DESCA agreement, which is the European Consortium or Collaboration template. And so all these requirements here are actually covered within that contract template. as I say, if the client is absolutely unwilling to allow publication, we have an escalation process at Loughborough, so it wouldn't be myself who makes a decision whether that activity could or could not happen. We send it to a very senior level, and then they actually come to a decision whether the activity is appropriate for a publicly funded university or not. Sometimes we do turn work down for that very reason. It's just that we can't contract. It's against everything we stand for. Okay, so that's the first red flag I've put on here. The second one, which Goga hinted, we're going to go into a little bit more detail further down the line. So I've just left that one blank at the moment, and then we're going to cover intellectual property in a little bit more depth. So the third major one for Loughborough, and again, I don't know if it's the same for you in Serbia, is liabilities. So within any contract, there'll be a provision for a penalty if something goes wrong. It could be non-delivery, it could be breach of confidentiality, it could be literally anything where it ends up in court and somebody is liable and has to pay a penalty. So we can minimise this by, as I put there, strong project management. The DESCA agreement in particular has very strong project management clauses within it, so that's very good. We see other contracts with no reference to that, and we have to obviously build it in our internal processes. But the main thing is, if the contract doesn't mention a liability limit, it's unlimited. And as a worst case scenario, the financial penalty could be enough to actually drive you out of business. So, as I said, we in the UK operate under charity law. We have a legal obligation to protect our assets and not put them under undue risk. So we would always ask for liability to be capped at a reasonable value. Some items, as I put there, they can't be excluded. So, for example, loss of life or personal injury, we are legally not allowed to exclude those from our contracts. And the other thing is that they'll, quite often with contracts, you'll have a section about liability, and then there may be other, what we call warranties and indemnities, built within the contract at different parts of the contract. We would always request those be included in the overall liability cap, otherwise you can have varying liabilities for different things. And the final point I'd make on liability, before I just go to the red flags, is liability should always be proportionate. So if it's a very small project for £500 or €1,000 or whatever, is it actually appropriate to have a €10 million liability cap? It needs to be absolutely proportionate to the value of the project. And the other thing we find within liability and contracts is quite often people will want indemnities for infringement of third-party IP rights. So at Loughborough, we have a massive wealth of background IP, which we can potentially bring to a project. So we've got this data, we've got this work we've done previously, and it can come from that many different sources, which we may or may not be allowed to license. So we might have done a piece of work for a funder, and that's got an exclusive licensing arrangement. And then if we then bring that to this project and license it, we're obviously breaching that previous contract, and we can be, took to court for that. The amount of work to actually check all those licensing means it's just something we actually avoid unless it goes through our enterprise team, who charge a higher fee to the client than we would because it builds in all these checks and balances within there. So does anybody have any questions? If you have got questions, I don't mind if you just shout up as we go through.
That also goes to our colleagues online. Please just type a question in the chat or speak up.
So the next sort of red line that we come across is governing law and jurisdictions. So every contract will or should state a governing law. So if things go wrong, whose legal process is it considered under, and where shall it be, you know, litigated? So it's what the location in the event of a dispute, effectively. So if we don't put a governing law in, then we get into a very convoluted legal process, and legal processes themselves are costly. So it would look at the activity, where it was taking place, who was funding it, etc., etc. So you would have to go through a lengthy legal process to actually get to a point where the court could tell you what an appropriate law was. The contract should always say what language it will be heard in. So in the contract that Loughborough have with Goga for this piece of work, it's held in Brussels under Belgian law, but in the English language. Particularly when we deal with Canadian partners, if it's not mentioned, then we would need to employ translators, etc. If it was heard in French, for example. And as I put there, most European Commission projects do naturally choose Belgium as the governing law, and it's widely accepted. There are other neutral laws, so we don't mind Swiss law in Loughborough. We can accept that quite readily. When we get over to the United States, it gets a little bit more complicated. So New York law is probably the most similar to UK law, whereas Californian law is that dramatically different. We have problems accepting that. And the reason comes down to, if things go wrong, it's the financial cost to fix them. So if we have to go over to the States, we send senior members of staff to the States, they would then need to get a local legal counsel to interpret the law, to apply it to our case. And it just gets more and more expensive as we go along. So this is why we can only accept certain governing laws. As I've said, neutral ones, there are neutral ones around. I think we have accepted the law of Singapore for some of our Far Eastern activity before now. But it needs to be related to the project benefits as well. The final thing on there that I've put is sometimes we are asked to do pieces of work with countries that might, for example, have human rights abuse issues, and we find it very difficult to actually accept that type of governing law. Some of the Middle Eastern countries we potentially have issues with in that respect. So do you normally go to Belgian law, or have you accepted any other ones? Or?
For European Commission projects, we do accept Belgian law.
Belgian.
Yeah, it's been like that through FP7 and on up to Horizon Europe right now.
Yeah, sure.
Have you ever had funding from any other international funders though?
Yeah, we do have the German funding, as I mentioned previously, from their Federal Ministry of Research, and this is where we accept German law because we cannot have it any other way. It's easy with European Commission, basically. It's the Belgian law and that's it. I don't know about other funders, if we can bring.
With American, no?
But that's different, that doesn't go to the institution,
Yeah,
it's covered in a different way, so I don't recall that we had some contracts with the Americans. Projects that we normally have, the bilateral ones, are regulated by the American Embassy in Belgrade, so it's kind of different grant management, it's not straightforward from the USA.
And what about
For the
Chinese
Embassy Joint
projects?
Secretariat,
Maybe Professor Sturgeon can say about Chinese projects, if you have any experience with,
Probably
it's
from the
bilateral,
ministry.
if you're asking about Chinese, it's bilateral.
Yeah.
Basically, it's governed by Serbian,
Serbian ministry.
for the Serbian side, so we don't have any conflicting issues.
For IPA Interrex, the JC, Joint Secretariat. it
But that's
is a
European
country that's
Commission.
also European
Yeah,
Commission.
yeah, so we're pretty much oriented towards the European
Towards
Commission,
Europe,
so
yeah.
let's say we're on the
About-
safe side in that area.
Still.
Still, yeah, yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, so at Loughborough, we have Chinese funding, we have quite a bit from the States, Canadian, then the various, we do actually have quite a lot of Swiss. And I think when we've dealt with Swiss funders, they legally can't accept anything other than Swiss law. That's my understanding.
Yeah, it's really good that you brought it up, because I can't recall what kind of law we had with the Scopes is the Swiss funding agency, and it's a bilateral Swiss-Serbian project, and we were very successful with 3 or 4 of those, but I don't remember.
And EEA grants,
The contract.
we never got one, the Norway EEA
Just a
grants.
sec,
I think it's usually that financial organization choose and decide who is which is jurisdiction. I think that in Scopus it was by Swiss laws. And also maybe when China also financing some project, maybe they decide that it's the Chinese.
But do you recall if with the Swiss, it was completely, the entire grant management was on their side? And they just transferred the money to us, so maybe there was no like.
Choosing.
Yeah, choosing. Do you remember? I don't. Frankly, I haven't had my eyes laid on the contract, so I don't know.
No, I don't know. They just send money. We have to
Give us money, justified expenditures.
Yes.
This is what we do by reporting the expenditures, but I don't recall signing the contract actually, which will maybe the case, right? But it was just the contract on their side, and we just implemented the activities. Yeah.
It's interesting, the different approaches.
It depends on the grant sponsor, actually, their rules and regulations, I think.
Yeah, you asked about the Norwegian grants.
No, we didn't get it, right?
Yeah, we did have.
We did have one.
Department of Biology and Ecology some time ago, but I really haven't seen the contract, so.
Yeah, I've done Norwegian funding.
It's EEA grants.
And I think we accepted Norwegian law, so we've certainly accepted, we get a lot of work from Denmark, and they always insist on Danish law, which we can accept. It's not dramatically different to our own. So, and the other thing is sometimes you will see, it's quite rare, but you'll see 2 different governing laws. So part of the contract will be covered by one, and then they might insist on one if it's particularly sensitive for data. A country that's got stronger data protection laws to cover that specific clause, but it gets a bit problematic in that respect.
Yeah,
it's, when my experience, for example, the Erasmus Plus, the strategic partnership, it depends on the country, the national Erasmus office in there, so it differs from a country to country. The contracts they given us, is depending on their national law.
Yeah,
it's the EU funds, but it's channeled through the national Erasmus office. And
yeah, it depends if it's centralized or decentralized governance,
Yeah, generally the fund has the upper hand. So it's a question of knowing, really, picking your battles, what to negotiate out of the contract and what to accept. So we've generally got a good idea if we can accept it, and we'll just do an informal approval and pending a full approval when, you know, the full picture's done.
Yeah, but what I think we all need here in Serbia, because we're not that immature now in receiving the grants. It's been many decades now that we're receiving some European grants. We should really have authority that we could turn to and ask, like ombudsman, right? So how do we solve this? So every single research institute or research intensive entity can ask questions around those very hot issues, but we don't have those. So we manage on our own pretty much. We're very creatively within the institution.
Yeah.
You understand me well.
Yeah. Well, we can touch on maybe later about how we work at Loughborough and the guidelines we work under.
That would be good.
Might be good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next, which is kind of the final red line, really. And that's confidentiality is a big issue for us. So effectively this protects anything that you're sharing within a project. So if you have some confidential information, it ends up in the public domain, you can sue your collaborator effectively. Now, the main thing on confidentiality provision is the length of the obligation. So the DESCA agreement says 5 years from the end of the project. So when it says from the end of the project, that could mean, in this case, it's an 8-year obligation in total. So it can actually build up on the longer projects. But 5 years is fairly reasonable. What we find quite often is there won't be a specific, the contract will say, keep this information confidential, but it won't say for how long for. So that means that you need to observe that obligation forever in perpetuity. Which, as I put there as a red flag, that's a burden, because what we'll generally find is people are less focused on keeping data secure the longer they have it. They kind of assume it doesn't matter anymore after a certain period of time, but it could be 20 years later if that information was leaked, or you left your office door open and somebody went in your filing cabinet, or whatever method, then you could still be sued for that. What we do find as well is that for different funding streams, so in the UK we might deal with a lot of military funding. Their length of confidentiality obligation is generally quite lengthy, so 20 years is typical for us to keep that information properly. So when we do come across these contracts, we have to gain further approvals in the UK, but the schools that do that type of activity will generally have really good mitigations in place to be able to comply with the funder. So I mentioned liability previously, but when we're actually doing non-disclosure agreements, we actually do accept unlimited liability, and that's because it's kind of standard within the contractual world. There is no way of negotiating that out of a contract usually, so we do accept it only on non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements.
Can I just say something?
Well, you can.
Would you advise us to have the NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, in place before going into collaborations? Because this is something we don't do normally as part of the practice. What we do is sign them when we are asked to do so by our partners.
It depends what you are exchanging. So if the idea that you are developing is very just broad concept, you might not need. But if for example, we were sitting down together and I said, look at this data I've got here, I've got this to this stage. And if you were having that type of conversation, then yes, you would put one in place. But then then again, generally you'd put it in place for a short period of time. So 6 to 12 months would be typical. If it was longer, then you would actually terminate that non-disclosure agreement when you got the consortium agreement in place. Because as I said earlier, you don't want different conflicting obligations in different contracts, or else it becomes very messy from a legal point of view if something does go wrong. So yeah, if you're exchanging information, usually you will have one in place. And then after it's been awarded, you wouldn't usually need one because it should be covered within your consortium agreement. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm recalling projects that we have at the moment, and some of them are really producing like super hyper innovations. And I can recall we had NDAs in place. But okay, we'll take good care in the future. Thank you.
Do you have your own, I guess, bank of documents here that you use? So we call them precedent documents. So if we were at the sort of project design stage, we could just get one of those agreements blank, fill it in. So in the same way as you use a blank DESCA agreement, we've got those our own personal ones for NDAs. We've got them for collaboration agreements of the different. So we've got a suite of probably about 15, 20 different precedents that we use.
Loughborough tailor-made, right?
Yes, exactly.
We don't have those in place. Basically, I make one when needed. Okay? Yeah. We call it UNSPMF template. And then we can use it.
So yeah, the idea with Loughborough is that those agreements are we need to. The only time we would need to obviously go to get anything further approved would be,
excuse me,
if the client negotiates something out.
Okay. Oh, well, could you retell the email?
Yes.
So there is an issue ongoing right now. Yeah.
Just ask you maybe to find the moment. Colleagues ask us that they got a contract and for Visegrad Fund project, and here you can find the draft of contract between us. Please let me know whether you have any suggestions, comments, change. Of course, you as well as your legal department or representatives. So they send us a contract to check and to give the answer. Comments.
Good job.
Okay.
Yeah, good. So that would be confidential, otherwise we could put it up on the screen and work through it as a live example.
Yes.
Oh, it's not. So, okay, so just to wrap up, I've got a couple of miscellaneous points here that we come across quite a lot. So what we found a lot of time is people will send us an incorrect type of agreement for the activity. So frequently we'll get a service contract for collaborative research, for example. And this is sometimes when, so similar to what we've just been discussing, a small company might not have a suite of contracts. They might just have their one only contract, which works for when they're working industry to industry, but it doesn't work in our case. So if that's the case, we generally either have to suggest using our own, which they may or may not accept. We get into a bit of what we call a battle of the forms there to try and use our own documents. If not, then we have to extensively rewrite that contract, which is very time consuming and problematic. And the other thing we get quite often is what we call blanket clauses in here. So quite often we see things about complying with export control, about human tissue, that sort of thing, which when we actually look at the project and it's, I don't know, looking at refugees in sub-Saharan Africa, it's completely inappropriate, and we have to try and negotiate those clauses out. try to get them removed. And then sometimes the client doesn't want that to happen, so we'd rewrite it and say, if the scope of the project changes, then we'll negotiate additional terms and conditions to comply with these rules. So that's most of our red flags. But I think IP is probably and we mentioned earlier, the biggest one that everyone wants to talk about. So every contract we deal with has something about IP on there. And we insist on that to actually protect. So I've mentioned background IP that we bring to a project. We need to protect our assets. We also need to decide what happens with the IP that's generated within the project. So mostly it will be owned by the person that generates it. It's the standard with the universities. With some funders, they may be more eager to own the IP. So actually the ownership of the foreground is the most negotiated clause that we have on contracts. The thing I put here as well, though, is it's important to actually consider, is there going to be any IP? Is it going to be something that we could exploit? Because what we find is quite often we negotiate quite lengthy conversations about IP when there isn't actually going to be any, which is a bit of a waste of time. So it's important to really have that conversation with the academic member of staff or the researcher to actually find out what the project's going to deliver. And as well as that, in the UK, we have quite a lot of funding that requires us to publish open access, and it's out in the public domain. So again, are we arguing about nothing? Is the question. So referring specifically to European Commission projects, and I appreciate this is a bit, with contracts, it's not got as many pretty pictures as Claire's presentations. It's a bit more black and white, so I do apologise for that.
It's okay.
You know, so generally in contracts, just to make you aware, the project details might have these pretty pictures, but they actually go in the appendices at the end of them. So you've gone through 30 pages before you get there. So that's my world. But the European Commission does give guidelines for intellectual property. So there's a requirement that the Consortium Agreement does set it out quite specifically, including, as we've said, the background, IP, how joint ownership's managed, how you need to transfer it if you're moving it around, any rules on access, third parties, so your industrial sponsors, for example, what are their expectations? And here again, there's a key point that there must not be a conflict with the grant agreement. You can't have one thing in one and one thing in the other. And if you did, then it should be actually picked up by the contract professional that was dealing with that, because we not only have to read the Consortium Agreement, we should be going through the grant agreement as well and trying to detect any conflict there. So the European Commission's agreed that the DESCA agreement complies with all of these requirements. So it's considered a model agreement that should cover their requirements, our requirements, and any partner requirements on a project with minimal alteration. So, as I said, there's going to be some do's and don'ts. So the main thing with a project that we find is if you have a background IP register, it makes life very easy. Otherwise, it can actually get very difficult to segregate the background from the foreground. In that case, you may have a dispute because, especially if you've got joint ownership on the foreground, it can become very problematic. And as projects change, what we find is we may bring in more up-to-date background IP. We might bring in background IP that's not been anticipated, but as the project's developed. So it's good practice to actually update it at your project meetings, especially if the deliverables are varied there. And they should be documented, those minutes. At Loughborough, we don't like to own things jointly because we like to be obviously able to, if we wanted to move something forward, we do that without involving anybody else. So for it to be in our decision-making capability. And also, as I put there, it's very difficult to manage, especially with the exploitation of the IP. And then the sector has kind of moved away from joint ownership of IP. It's becoming less common within the sector. So we try to avoid it. And also, as I've said previously, if you are bringing background, then check those licensing conditions, especially if you're bringing it from another project. If it's something you've sat in your office and worked on for your own interest, it's slightly different. But if somebody else has paid you to get the project to a certain point and then you bring that to feed in, then certainly check those licensing arrangements. And that leads on to obviously taking the appropriate steps to avoid infringement, which is a massive issue if it happens. And finally, as I said, with IP, we kind of get into battles with it. So I put a little note at the end there to really negotiate in good faith, really, and to be pragmatic. So we're working with other universities. We should all be kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, as we say in the UK. And also, if we can give ground on something, it makes life easier if it's not going to affect us massively. So we always try to give as well as insist on those red lines. And it also builds our relationships. So I'm sure, I'm not sure if you have, Goga, but we've all had some funders or some collaborators that are virtually impossible to deal with, and we don't tend to go back to them, whereas if it's an easy process, we would. And in the UK, that can be other universities as well. We have some difficult ones.
Yeah. I don't know if we have those, I'm sure we do. Do we have any difficult ones either?
I would have a lot to say about this. It's diverse here in Serbia, IP in general, regulation and contribution of universities in I don't know, in everything. So we are in diapers here, and I'm very enjoying what you're saying.
Okay.
Because it's making me think now. So I'm not so much to speak. I'm just
soaking in.
Yes, inhaling this information now, and thinking how to apply them.
Well, I mean, once it's sunk in and you've thought about it, then obviously, we're in regular touch.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I don't mind at all if you want a follow-up conversation or anything like that.
Yes.
So we've done the do's, so we'll move on to the don'ts. So the avoidances.
It's a longer list, actually. I can see that. Yeah.
It's a longer list, but I think some of all the points should be valid, but some are more valid than others. So I think we naturally assume that our employees, our academic staff, our support staff, our contract managers actually know what IP is and the importance of protecting it. I think that assumption is probably not the correct one to make. So different people will have very different views on IP. Some will be very passionate about protecting it and some really won't care. So I think that's right, isn't it, Claire?
Yeah, some just want to do the research and they're not,
Yeah.
Move on, yeah.
So I think that we need to ensure everybody understands those contractual obligations, especially when you're dealing with partners IP. So we all know that sometimes stuff changes hands without the correct agreements in place. And hopefully nothing will come of it, but there will come a day when there's an issue. And unfortunately, that's when people will have to start following the rules, as it were. But as I spoke about earlier in the presentation, it's sometimes about research, you know, contract managers actually sitting down with staff and explaining it. So that could be in the form of, you know, project kick-off meeting. It makes sense to have a member of the contract staff there, as well as, for example, somebody from finance or who's going to be managing the budgets, that sort of thing. So that's something we're actually looking at Loughborough at the moment.
So that's a great example. So at the very kick-off meeting of the project, you have this session that you can deliver on managing the IP, right? Did I understand you well?
Yes, it's pointing out what's in the contract. So, as Claire said, that some of our academics are just focused on doing the research. They might think, you know, for example, you know, Bill Jan has sent me a spreadsheet of confidential information, but then they might think, oh, my friend's working on that down at Southampton University, and they send it on because they don't understand what's in the contract, what the requirements are there. And then if that then there's an issue with that, we're in breach. And it's, the contract is with Loughborough University, not the specific member of staff. And we never allow our academics to enter into agreements. It has to be an authorised signatory at Loughborough. So in a way, it's Loughborough University would take a hit on whatever legal action, but then there would probably be internal action against that member of staff. But we can mitigate that by sitting down and making sure they understand what's regulating the project, if that makes sense.
It does. It
makes a lot of sense.
Perspectives of what we do, because if you ask me personally, I think that that many of those boundaries are blurred. So we might not be always doing the right thing.
And you learn as you go along as well. So none of these things are set in stone. None of them are like we've dealt with that. It's perfect now, and you never have to revisit it because things change. You know, regulation changes, laws change, staff members change, structures change. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. Similar thing, relying on existing processes to protect that IP. We're in a very different world now. I was just talking about change. So now we've potentially got people accessing project information from mobile phones, from working at home, maybe leaving the screens unlocked because it's their house, that sort of thing. So, you know, it's considering how this changed world could impact what we're doing. As I said, granting ownership of the results to a funder or collaborators. So in some cases it's appropriate, particularly to a funder, but a licensing arrangement can usually be the way forward with it. So especially with our smaller commercial partners, they generally want to own it. I have to own it, whereas they just actually need to use the results for the research, for example. So ownership can be the red line in a lot of cases, but if you work around it and if you talk through with the company, you might find a more appropriate route. Granting access to background is something we wouldn't do other than just to directly deliver the project. It's very problematic. If somebody then wanted to further use that, then we'll frequently see in contracts that, you know, further licensing's on fair and reasonable terms. So it's placing a value on our assets and not allowing somebody to have free rein and go off and make a fortune from our hard work effectively.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
For example, in our EXtremeClimTwin project, as you well know, we have this background IP coming from Manfred and Climate Risk Analysis and Cicero, Norwegian Institute. Both of them just stated their IP in that
in the table.
In the table, exactly. So and if there's a third party now interested in the results of the project, which somehow understand and rely on that their own IP background, would they need to negotiate further in Manfred and Cicero? Or it would be EXtremeClimTwin project, who would be the negotiator from our side?
Yeah, the background IP will sit with whoever it is, so with climate risk analysis, or so they'll retain ownership of that. So if somebody wants to build on the results of this project and use that background IP, then it would be Manfred who would negotiate that license with them. As a project, we wouldn't be able to, because it will be built in the contract that it's only granted for delivery of the project and validation of the results, for example.
Okay, I thought so. I just wanted to check. So it would be Cicero and CRA to further give the license under reasonable conditions.
Yes.
Thank you.
It usually says fair and reasonable terms. The next point we have to consider as well. So we're publicly funded, and quite often people want to own the IP, etc., etc. And if we actually granted them that wish, when they're not actually, quite often they'll pay us not our true cost. For example, they might pay us our direct costs, but not any associated overhead. So if we were subsidising that research using public money, then we can get into I think it's called state aid in Europe, and it's now changed to subsidy control in the UK laws. So we have to be very careful. And that benefit, it could be, if it's got the potential to distort the market, you know, by granting them that advantage, end up in trouble. And the final thing is our university name and logo. We get people wanting to sort of almost say Loughborough University says this is fantastic. We don't want that to happen unless they put in a request to use it with written permission. Otherwise, it's a bit of a free-for-all. There is a benefit associated with that name and logo. So that is the end of me talking through that bit. I just thought if we put the DESCA agreement up, and I can just show people. So we're
relying on this one.
We've just done one.
Yeah, I don't know why. Could you just please click escape so I can access the. What do we do?
No.
Okay, very good. Just so we need to share this one now.
Okay.
Share the presentation.
Just go to share, screen share.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, that one. Yeah.
This is it.
That's it.
Okay. Sorry?
The air conditioning.
Air
It's
conditioning is
on.
on. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
you-
it's on. Can we lower the temperature, please? Yeah, 23 would be good. Maybe you can make it a little bigger.
Yeah, I'll just
Which is in hold and control.
So,
I'll do it here. It's-
Da. Kablovi.
Tamo fali, ne?
ali šta im može biti?
Pa negdje se krekira.
Mislim, sklonjeno uz kabla, možda ti.
Možda ja, ne znam.
Šta je bila? Ne, to je struje.
Jesam ga.
It's that we can't
Oh, we
see.
have the other one.
We can't see in the room, but colleagues online can see the documents very well, so you can move
They
them.
can see.
Yeah, okay.
So I just thought it would make sense to show you this type of agreement, which I've referred to if you haven't seen it before. So this is the one that whenever you get awarded a project, Ergo has to complete for you. So this is, yeah, so,
Would you like a mouse?
yeah,
ahead.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have a table of contents here, which is like an index. And in this type of agreement, there'll be yellow sections, which is where you're offered a choice. Anything else should be just added as is. So if I just go into the agreement, you will see it's a very lengthy document. And I'll just go through until I get to something we've talked about. You see here, this is about breach. So that will lead into liability. We can see here that the involvement of third parties, that was a requirement that the agreement includes. So you can see that the requirements are all actually covered it within here. So this is where we see the liability caps that we talked about. You've got two options here. So the value of what you receive, twice the value. None of those would usually cause a massive issue for us at Loughborough. But the other thing here is, it does carve out the breach of confidentiality. We normally wouldn't cover that indirect or consequential loss, so it does carve that out of the liability cap. And it does add in a couple of things here. So at Loughborough, we would only usually cover items that can't be covered by law, and this adds in a couple here. All of this information here is about project management. So as I said, it's got very strong project management procedures within this document, which is very good. And it covers everything, voting rights, veto, minute and meetings, that sort of thing.
It's very, very detailed.
It's very
Very
detailed.
detailed, yeah.
And this is why, with it being so detailed, it's why it's so widely accepted. So even though it doesn't exactly tick all of Loughborough's boxes, if we're awarded a European project, I wouldn't actually dream of using a different template, because everybody would push back and say, well, we always use the DESCA agreement. I'm just looking to see if there's, I think the exploitation and IP. So here we have the IP, so we're talking about results. So whoever generates them owns them. It covers joint ownership, which, as I've said, we try to avoid, but dependent on the project. And it covers transfer of results, which is one of the requirements from the Commission. And then also this is about public qualification here, so dissemination of results, which again was one of those red lines we talked about earlier. And it talks about you having to give knowledge, notice to all the collaborators to allow them to review it, which is all perfectly standard.
Yeah, but I've had cases, and probably you as well, that people wanted to that 45 days, those 45 days reduced to 30.
Yeah.
And we did accept those in two previous contracts.
I think 30 is not problematic.
Yeah, but less it would be.
But if
right?
somebody says 7 days, then it can be more problematic because you might be on holiday.
Absolutely.
So you have to think about whether you can comply with these clauses. It might be that if it was a deal breaker, you would accept that if you could put you out of office on directing them to somebody else, for example. But again, we see use of names and logos is covered within here. So all of those red lines we've talked about are covered. But I think it probably gives you a little bit of an idea of how lengthy these agreements are.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do to negotiate a contract. And when I talked earlier about maybe having project kick-off meetings, I would actually, in the case of an agreement like this, I would just highlight the key clauses. Most of the stuff doesn't really need to be understood by an academic or a member of the support team. I won't go through it to the end. We can see that this is the governing law here.
Yeah.
And it also actually quite conveniently sets out what method of dispute resolution. So mediation's less binding than arbitration, for example. But you can choose a combination of those, which I think we did go. First of all, we'll go mediation, then we'll go arbitration, and then it goes to court. So it makes it less likely to happen.
Yeah, we also did one thing in our contract, in our consortium agreement. We specified a bit more the process of mediation, who would be involved. So the deans, the directors, whoever is the authorized legal representative of the institution. We can tweak this in that way, right? So specify and go more into details if needed.
Yes, you can add bits into this agreement. What I would generally, so if I receive this agreement, normally I'll pull up a blank one and I'll pull up the one I've received and I'll just cross-reference the key clauses just to check nobody's trying to pull the wool over my eyes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Lack of a better expression.
Can I also say one good thing? There's this DESCA model, which is a template, but there's also that DESCA model with elucidations. So each of the clauses that you find in this contract is explained. So you know actually what it's all about. You have that kind of help to understand better what the article is all about. I find it very useful.
It is good, yeah. And this here is your background. So we've talked about that, setting up an IP register. This is saying exactly what each party's bringing to the show. So there's a table there for them to complete. Claire likes tables, so she approves of that. So yeah, I won't really go through it anymore, but I'll just flip to the end of it. So we have a 46-page document there without the project description that's been put in. So yes, that explains why it can be a very lengthy process to not only get this to a position where it can be circulated, but also as soon as you send it to another organisation, they take a month to review it. So
back and forth. But it's a process. So I remember Maria last year, they had a really big problem back and forth with our university and Croatian partners. So our university had one point of view, and it took I think about month and a half back and forth with the contract. But I think it's good because when you have it in it, when you sign it, that's it. So from point of view of researchers, Maria, it was a long process, but I think from a legal department, it's okay. So they were just going back and forth and defining every sections. So if anything occurs, you have it in a contract. If you don't have it, then it's a gray area and it's,
Negotiation is always challenging.
it is.
But we take the approach at Loughborough that we'd usually ask once. So if an agreement comes through, I'd mark it up and I'd say, we can't usually agree to this, could I suggest this, etc., etc. And then if they accept those, that's great. If they accept some and say, well, we can't move on this one, then usually I'd take advice from a more senior member of staff and say, these are the project details. Are you happy if we proceed based on this? And they might say yes, they might say no. But we try to avoid that going backwards and forwards like a tennis match, because sometimes we find people arguing about each little word. And so we try to be pragmatic and just say, look, it means the same thing. So if it helps, I'll just accept that.
I also had a case of Spanish partner who was very firm and very specific and about the length of this highlighted number of days. So they were so specific. We can't do less than 60 days, and the recommendation was 45. Because our institution is very diverse and we have many departments, so the information travels for ages throughout the entire circle of people who need to know about it. Then I said, okay, what can we do? Accept. So we did. I don't think we would have it any other way, basically.
And with a lot of things, if it's an obligation to send something to a partner to review, it's probably slightly different because you have to do that every time. But sometimes we'll argue about something that's unlikely to happen.
Yes.
in real terms. Yeah. So I don't think we need to go back to my other thing, because the only other point I had on that was, is there any questions?
Okay.
So it's a little bit of a brief intro to contracts. It explains
how fun they can be, huh?
Well, they can not only be fun, but contract staff can be viewed as the people blocking the process. But there's reasons why it has to happen is I guess what I'm trying to get across.
This was what I was saying. So from the point of view of the researcher, he does want to get it signed to start with a project, but the law department had different issues.
It is.
Ja, det har också varit.
Okay. Can you move first?
It's a whirlwind tour of what we did this morning. Okay, dissemination communication. So the last bit of today, and then you're free. So the first bit is around dissemination exploitation of results. I think we've got a Horizon 2020 slide, I'm sorry. Dissemination exploitation are a requirement of funders, and particularly the EU, and the EC has particular requirements for the need to disseminate and exploit your results. Ignore that slide, it's old. I put it in by mistake. So first, some definitions for you. So communication. So communication is about promoting the project, and there's a nice megaphone there in the middle, shouting about your project, telling the world about it throughout the whole lifespan. So right from day one all the way to the 36 project. And the aim of these communication activities is to inform and reach out to wider society and show what you've been doing and the use and how the project will benefit European citizens. So that's the purpose of communication. Then we have dissemination. This is defined as the public disclosure of the results that you've had in your project by the appropriate means. Now, in your work programme, you will define whether each deliverable and output is public, private, for the consortium only. Most of them need to be public unless you agree otherwise, or there is a very specific need for it to remain private. Do you have any private deliverables in one?
Just one, yeah, it's the scientific strategy.
Yeah, so that's something you probably don't want to share with the world, but everything else is.
Until the project is over, then we said that it will be open to public. If I remember.
Yeah, in some years.
Yeah.
Not straight away.
So those that you are making public should be made available by whatever means necessary, other than resulting from protecting or exploiting the results. So this includes scientific publications as well, and making sure that they're available to the scientific community. So this is the difference between communication and dissemination. But obviously, there's a lot of interlinks between the two, because in order to disseminate, you have to communicate. So they're very well connected. So there's some nice things here that talk about how the types of things that have been included in each one. So for each one, it's important to have a clear objective of what you want it to achieve, a focus of what it is, and a target audience. So we're going to come back to that target audience again that we had in the table this morning. So, but your target audience for this might be different than your target users in impact. So bear that in mind. So this, I'll go through probably each one. I'll maybe talk about exploitation just a little bit more because we talked about it earlier. So exploitation is about effectively using your results and to turn them into concrete value and impact for society, as we've talked about this morning. And it's not restricted to commercial use. And the target audience for this is people or organisations, including your project partners, that actually make use of the project, as well as user groups outside the project. So exploitation of, for example, the project we're here today, could be Biljana using some of the research findings that she's developed and the methodologies that she's learned about from the project and developed to develop a whole new research program afterwards. That's still exploitation of project results because it's leading to something concrete afterwards. So it's quite broad.
Sorry, but it's also when somebody else uses the results.
Yeah, and when somebody else uses them as well. So it can be internal, external, it could be anything, which makes it kind of hard to track, actually, I personally think. So communication, we've talked about reaching out to society, and it's about, part of this is about recognising that your projects are funded by the people and they're funded by citizens effectively through tax and that kind of thing. So it's the EC are quite keen that the general public sees where that money is going and what it's being used for. So the types of things, so it could be used to address and provide possible, so the objective is about providing possible solutions to fundamental societal challenges, climate change, problems in the oceans, pollution, etc., etc. So the focus is then about informing and promoting the project and its results and success in the focus of that objective, in the way that objective aligns to the way that EU's working and the work programme that you sit under, and the mission as well. And also, in terms of the target audience for communication, it's huge. There are multiple audiences beyond the project's community, and this includes the media, the wider public, scientists across the world. It's huge. And this comes back to your stakeholder list. Who is it you need to communicate with, why, and then coming back to what's the objective, what's the purpose of communicating with them, and how does that help your project outcomes be more widely taken up. And then we have dissemination. So this is the transfer of the results and actually getting it out there and ensuring that people are using them. So the focus of this is to describe and ensure that results are available for others to actually use. And this is your results from the project. The audiences can be quite different here from your communication. So in your communication, you might want to work with the media to make a big, we had this big investment, we won this great project. Whereas dissemination is more about people that will actually use the results. So it might be more of a focus on the scientific community that you work with. It might be thinking about local authorities and policymakers, the way your projects might actually influence and change in policy. Or it might be industrial partners who are going to take your, whatever you've done onto the market in the future. So this is going to be quite quick actually, I'm rattling through this very fast. If anyone's got any comments or questions or anything to add, please do. This is actually my last slide actually. So European Commission also has their own services to help you support your dissemination of your project findings. And I think these are great because it just means you don't have to find the budget within your project to do these things. You can use them. So the first one is the Open Research Europe platform, and this is an open access publishing platform for scientific papers from Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe beneficiaries. It also has open peer review and article revision. So if you are unable to publish open access through your own institution, you can do it this way. We have the Horizon Results platforms. This is a platform showcasing your research results, finding collaboration opportunities, and finding out what's going on in other projects. And this can be really useful actually if you find other projects that are working in similar space to yours. So for example, there's probably some other twinning projects in Serbia. And so it's nice sometimes to go, oh, maybe we'll go talk to them and find out what they did and compare what we did, and maybe we can share some resources. So it's a really nice way to find out what else is going on in a similar area to yours. Then they have the Horizon Results Booster, which sounds very exciting. I've never used this myself. It's a free consulting service, including a portfolio, dissemination, and exploitation strategy. So I think my understanding is this is about helping you develop business plans. And if you have something that you want to take to market or license to industry, it's kind of there to help you do that. And I think this is great because it's a really difficult thing to understand if it's not a world that you work in, like business investments and that kind of thing. So I think it's great they're doing that. And the last one is Innovation Radar. This is a new initiative and it identifies high potential innovations from EU funding, and it recognises them and then supports those projects and innovators to reach the market with that innovation as well. So they have put quite a lot of things in place to try and help projects not just stop at the end of them, but actually continue.
I can add something about Innovation Radar because our faculty of Sciences is on Innovation Radar, thanks to 2 projects run by the Department of Mathematics and Informatics. They were recognized by the Commission for a couple of innovations, which are a direct result of the projects that we are implementing. And we were actually called by the European Commission if we want to claim our page on the Innovation Radar, and we of course said yes, we want to do that. So I was the one to create this portfolio for the University of Novi Sad Faculty of Sciences, and I think it's really super fantastic that we are there. So we have already 2 innovations, and there's a clear description of what kind of innovation it is, and which stage of innovation it is, and the possible market potential and the possible directions, but the project are not over yet. And there's a third, we've been called for the 3rd time to claim the innovation page, but there are some issues to be discussed among the partners, which brings us back to the contracts. There would be some patenting problems, issues, let's call them. They might not be problems, and they need to be discussed among partners. So if everything goes smoothly, this is going to be another thing on the Innovation Radar for the University of Novi Sad Faculty of Sciences, and I'm proud of saying this now. Yes, so we are out there. I don't think that we are actually using these opportunities very much because people take the usual routes, media and social networks and appearances on TV, radio stations, and so on and so forth. But there's so much more if you, especially if you want to be seen really internationally.
And you need to write a plan about this in your proposal. You need to explain the types of communication and dissemination activities you're going to undertake and how those will help you to achieve your impact. So you have to write a whole plan about how you're going to do it anyway. So it's important to try and be creative, but not like out there, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's all sorts of things you can do. So Biljana, I thought it would be really useful if you can tell us a little bit about the types of dissemination and communication that we use in EXtremeClimTwin. If you're happy to do that.
Yes, and just one sec. And then maybe you can just go back to the very bright examples of Loughborough, coupled with the scientists and little things that you do on your own, so we can share them with the audience. So
absolutely.
For the communication, actually, we use social networks, and we actually communicate all the events that we organize or that we actually take part of. For the dissemination part, we send the invitations, also use the website and social networks to send invitations to our friends and colleagues who are also in climate extremes to join us on webinars, on seminars, on different workshops. Also publish the scientific papers, participate. We actually had online participation for the conferences because of the COVID situation. What else? For the exploitation, we managed to make the Zenodo account for our project. We put all the materials that we got for the workshops, we put them there. We said that it can be freely used by the other people who would like to replicate the results or use this methodology for their research or their study area. So this is Zenodo account, and also part of our website is also equipped with all the scripts for the research and everything that has been done so far. Also, we have a YouTube channel. On the YouTube channel, we provide all lectures, hands-on exercises from the workshops. So anyone who would like to replicate the results and do the similar analysis can actually do that. So just by looking the videos and doing step-by-step study on their own data and probably get some meaningful results for their region or area. So this is how we organize it. Also, we thought about for the future, because we have to improve our study programs, that some of the materials from the workshops can be a part of different study courses. For example, higher climate extremes, we can use Python scripts to show students how they can calculate different extreme indices, or use different downscaling models to show them what is going on if they use grid data or station data, etc., etc. So these actually materials that we produce during workshops will be used in study programs for the UNSPMF, and probably by the people who actually participated in the conference, in the workshops. And also we produced together we produced step-by-step guides for different, for example, for different programs that we use. So Minusha, for example, produced step-by-step guide for statistical downscaling model. It will be a part of the SDSM website. So people will use the materials that we produce during workshops when they use the SDSM software. So this is something that we actually managed to do.
And I've shared the screen so you can see how dissemination looks like in EXtremeClimTwin project. And just bear with me because it takes time to open the page. But
project results.
We okay, about copy policy, go away please. So these are where our project results are stored, and you can really access everything that went public so far. You can download the slides, you can see the recordings, you can, as Vidana said, replicate the results and use it and exploit them further on. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you will be able to watch all the recordings we did so far, and we did everything. Every presentation, every workshop, every webinar.
If you go to playlists, you will see.
Yeah, they are sorted out through playlists and you can see that, sorry?
To hear our lovely voices.
You can hear actually all of us speaking in many presentations. There will be Claire and Adam, and in the scientific ones, there will be researchers presenting to you. So I think this is, I'm not tooting our horn, but I think it's really brilliant and resourceful.
Yeah, and what we actually did to bridge the gap between the activities, we organized the lunchtime talks and asked our friends, the researchers from partner institutions, you have that lunchtime talks and extreme climate events.
Yeah.
You see? Up.
No, I don't.
Up, just up there. There.
Lunchtime talks.
And there are 3 talks on climate extremes. So we had presentation colleagues from the department, from partner institutions, and also asked our former colleagues to join us, like Professor Jana Silman, or our friends from different universities who tackle the same problems in their institutions. So this is something interesting, and we're actually thinking about continuing this activity in September, maybe, because we have more people who are interested in giving talks. So this is something that can be easily done because we have now Zoom and different teleconferencing opportunities. So this is something additional to the project proposal. This is something that we did not promise, but actually it's a good idea to just keep in close contact and send invitations to all people and all researchers who are interested in climate or climate change or climate extremes. So somehow networking is better when you have some kind of event like this.
Yeah, so please go and watch the recordings and enjoy them as well. I just wanted to say that everything that we've said so far is a piece of a puzzle. So Bidena was mentioning Zonaldo and other resources. So this is in line, if you remember the eligibility criterion to do the open data and open access in your projects. And there's this FAIR principle, which means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Your results simply must be like that. And this is how you do it. This is about replicability and reusability and accessibility. And since we've put all our results out there, so they're very public, you can help yourself with them and educate yourself or just enjoy what we're doing here.
The only condition is that the project is cited, because on Zenodo there is every material has its own DOI number, so it has to be cited. If you use it, just acknowledge the project, acknowledge the people who actually made for example, the script you use, and that's it.
That's a good point. That also goes for if you're downloading the presentations that are out there indeed. So please just acknowledge that it's from the EXtremeClimTwin project. We will greatly appreciate that. And thank you very much. With this, I would give the floor back to Claire, who will probably
maybe I can use the internet as well.
Absolutely, yeah, just go ahead. And show you the very good things that are being done at Loughborough University and how they share their results and promote their research and research.
I just wanted to say that we also have university repository of the University of Novi Sad. So every publication actually goes automatically on that repository. So it is open to everyone. So the publications can be downloaded from the repository of the University of Novi Sad, and also from the website of project or Zenodo platform or whatever. So there are a lot of opportunities to download the results and use them for further research.
And measure your impact in this way. This is very important. So this is quite measurable. So you can see how many people saw your website, or how many people clicked your page, and how many views you have on your Facebook page or Instagram, and so on and so forth. Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how Loughborough just promotes our research, not necessarily this project, but just in general. So we have our homepage, and on here it's mostly focused to students. But if we go down, we have lots of things about research. So these are all our news stories at the bottom, which are some of them are institutional news stories, but some of them are research, some of them are sports, as you can see, and there's all sorts really. You can see what types of things are there, you know, so we have that all on our website. So anyone that, you know, we promote that externally as our news. We also have internal news promotion as well. So if we go here, this is our internal news board. So sometimes it's just news, like sadly somebody's died, which is very sad.
Sorry, so hard.
I looked at this today, but there's like news about sports, and then we have some research and parking. But there's research promotion that goes on here as well. So this is a research outcome. This is a research outcome. If you cook with sound, you can make more environmentally friendly jam, apparently. So there's all sorts. So this, you know, all the research kind of outcomes are here as well. And then the other thing we have, which I think is really good, and we did this in one of our webinars, is you can see where we are. So we have a podcast, which is called Cuppa with a Scientist. So when we say cuppa, I mean a cup of tea, a very English cup of tea, maybe with a biscuit. And it's a podcast that our public relations team have launched. And what they do is they basically interview one of our academic colleagues, maybe once a month, I think, on different research topics. And they just have a general chat about their background and how they got to where they got today, the research that they're doing, the projects that they have, and it's just really nice. Like, you've listened to a few, they're just really nice to listen to. So Tom Matthews did one, didn't he? He used to work on this. It's Rob's done one as well now.
I don't know about Rob's, but we'll promote.
So we have 8 episodes. So we have one on cognitive psychology, physics. Oh, I think it might be this one.
This is extreme weather scientist, yeah.
Rob.
You get the idea what it's like. So it's just quite nice to listen to, and it's really promotional. So podcasts are another really good way to get stuff out there, but you can be really creative. So I worked on one project where it was to do with satellite data, and we were thinking about linking up. It didn't get funded sadly, but we're thinking about linking up the National Space Centre in Leicester in the UK with the Space Centre in Toulouse in France, and having like a video link between them, so children in the different towns could talk to each other from the different space centres on the internet. And there's just all sorts of things you can do that just make it really interesting. Yeah, that's probably all to say really, but I just, you know, be creative and try things and have a look what other projects have done as well in the past, and just build on that, but be appropriate as well.
Yeah.
You know, Here, this is a relatively small project, really, when we talk about European funding. So our communication and dissemination is appropriate for the type of project. If you're doing something like developing a driverless car, you might be doing a whole other level of
different sets of tools.
Outreach.
Yeah. And of course, you don't want to jump out of people's refrigerators. Yeah, you want to dose nicely the news that you are sharing and make them pertinent to your audience and give them just enough time to really be into what's going on in your project and not be there all the time. Yeah.
And the thing is that they're probably more interested when you find something rather than right at the beginning of your project. Because so right at the beginning of your project, your local people are interested, your local media, because it's a big deal. You've got some funding to the region, it's great. And then you have a bit of a lull while you do some work. And then you find something out that's really cool. And then you can start sharing that, and then it starts building up momentum. So
exactly.
Yeah, that's probably the best way I can describe it.
Thank you very much,
That's
Claire.
okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Back to you. Control.
Thank you.
But if anyone has any ideas for
Yes.
dissemination or communication, please feel
Yes.
free to share them with the room, or anything that has worked for you on one of your projects or proposals.
We have some spare minutes right now. If there is anyone here or online that wants to share some brilliant practice and some very successful dissemination and communication you did on your projects, we would appreciate. We're on the lookout for new and fresh ideas.
I have one question.
Very good.
How to make balance in the numbers of scientific papers? Because you want to show your team that we are on the top, but how to find balance?
Oh, I think it's experience, sadly, and talking to your experienced colleagues who've worked on these projects and try and get an idea, but it's so variable depending on the project and what you're doing. Yeah,
I agree. I don't have any.
What I would say is undercommit in your proposal, undercommit.
Yeah.
So say you're going to produce 3 or 4, and then if you do 7, then that's great. You've overproduced, but don't overcommit in what you write in your proposal, because you're going to make your life very difficult. And the other thing with papers, you're not in control of the timescales in quite the same way as you would be if it was a report or something you're publishing. So it's perfectly reasonable to say you're going to publish a small number within the lifespan of the project, but afterwards you'll aim and publish more. So does that help a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
We talked about this and we needed to explain how far we will go during the project lifespan. And there was the baseline. And this was the very first deliverable we submitted to the European Commission. And that is production by the moment the project started. So this was the jumping board that will lead us to a different production 3 years in the future. So you measure what you do, you find an average, you see your capabilities and what team brings. It's not you anymore and your immediate people, it's more people who bring more value. And then you can maybe be more ambitious than you would otherwise be if it was an incremental improvement on the road.
The other thing that I think is really important, and maybe you guys can add something, it's important to allocate responsibility to somebody for some of the communication activities as well. So I think we've seen Tim's looking after it for EXtremeClimTwin, so I guess he looks after the Twitter account, and and that's his job and he's responsible for that. And it means you don't have to worry about it because you know it's in his capable hands. And you might tell him to put something on or whatever. But
if you hit our EXtremeClimTwin Facebook page or Instagram, you will see that the news been already there since yesterday, and there will be more because we have been sending Tim the photos all the time throughout the meeting yesterday and today. So thank you, Tim, for taking care. Even though he's not in the room, he's taking care of the media and everything.
And if you have a really, really big project, it's perfectly reasonable to have a person funded by the project to look after this stuff. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do as well.
Any thoughts from our colleagues online, or questions, or good practice to be shared? Nope. Well, are there any other comments from colleagues who are here? No? Then I believe it's time to say thank you, everybody, online and offline. Thank you to our presenters. All users for your attention, and I hope there will be takeaways from these two lovely and rich days. Stay tuned. There will be more news and publications and productions from EXtremeClimTwin projects in the future. So please follow us on firstly our website and then our social media accounts. Thank you very much to all of you who participated. We appreciate you following the project, and I hope you benefited from these 2 days. Thank you to our colleagues in the room for being here, and of course, we're open to all questions anytime, not only today, but in the future as well. Hvala lepo. Thank you very much. It's been lovely to have you for the workshop, and looking forward to future collaborations.
And can I just say thank you to everyone for being such great hosts, and it's been great to meet you in person, some of you having seen you on the screens.
Yes.
Thank you very much for having us in Serbia. It's been a great experience. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you from me as well.
Learned a lot about your country in the last week.
That's nice to hear. Thank you so much. Milos, thank you very much for being a very active participant. Thank you to Natasha for sharing as well. Thank you to all the colleagues from the faculty who couldn't be all the time with us in the room, but were following closely. It's very much appreciated. Everybody have a nice... Sorry?
Thank you for invitation.
Absolutely, you will be